you know what? He said, I was going to kill you then. I got out my gun. I tried to shoot you in the head. He said, and this gun, and he slaps this gun, has never failed me. He said, it wouldn't work, and I tried it 3 times to shoot you, to kill you, and it wouldn't work. And now I know why. He said, because God is with you.
Welcome, everybody. This is Simon Gilbert with Inspired. I'm super excited this week to have another fantastic guest with us. His name's Dunc Dyason. He was awarded an MBE for his work in, setting up Toy Box and also Streetkids Direct. Lives in Guatemala, been there for, I think, 3 decades. And I'm just really excited to hear all about him. For those of you that are new to Inspired, we're just all about telling great stories of stirring faith, of overcoming many different challenges, and I've got in different mates from all sorts of randomly varied walks of life over the last number of months. And actually, I can't claim Dunc as a mate yet, although maybe after an hour together we can. But a friend of mine wrote to me just a few days ago and said, this is Charlotte Cox, shout out to you, Charlotte, saying you just got to get this guy, and he's got great stories. So I'm looking forward to it. So Dunc, welcome.
Thank you very much. After that introduction, I can't wait for it myself.
Great to have you. Now, you're in England briefly, but you're based in Guatemala. I think that's been your main context of ministry. But let's go right back. Let's dig into let's start with the program that sort of changed your life. I gather you're watching a TV program on Sunday night, and it changed the course of your life. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, I got home from youth group. I was a youth worker in Cheshire Boys in Buckinghamshire.
Okay.
Got home after youth group very late one night, Sunday night, and turned on the TV, watched the news. I didn't know this program was coming up. And this text appeared across the screen, red text that said, they shoot children, don't they? And this program, BBC Everyman program, not only transformed my life, but transformed everything about the way I thought about the world and how I thought about children, because the program was portraying the situation of young children who are living on the streets, which I'd never really heard of before, but living on the streets of a country called Guatemala. Mm-hmm. Not only was that bad enough, but were being hunted down, tortured and killed by the people that you would have thought would be there to look after them, the police.
Right.
And so when I watched this program, it was a harrowing program. And at the end of that program, I was like, I've got to do something. I've got to try and help in some way.
And that was that 1992?
That was 1991. But what little did I think that trying to raise some money to help street children through the youth group, which was an easy thing, little did I know that actually a year later I would be on those same streets working with a lot of the children that appeared in that documentary, and going around with the teams, collecting bodies of street children and burying street children, working with street children. It was just the most bizarre but also most rewarding experience of my life.
I think I'm 49. How old are you now?
So I'm 62 this July.
Okay, right. Because I think 1992, I went to Brazil for a similar deal. It was work with Streetkids, and we got mugged on day one, and my sort of misconceptions about them being cute little kids. They've been buggered since day one. They were real survivors, and there was a policeman on the main square of Sao Paulo with a gun there to shoot them, because they were criminals. They had to steal and mug to survive, and we got mugged on that first day. And it was the scariest experience of my life, I'll be honest. I mean, I've had much more dangerous experiences living in a war zone in Burundi since, but that was the scariest, because often you fear what you don't really understand. And as we ran off with being showered with glass bottles, and in the evening we processed that experience, and I was weeping just at the brokenness of the few of the 7 million street kids that we just met, a handful of them. And as I wept, the team leader put his arm around me and said this line, which has literally changed and defined my life. He said, "Pity cries." I was crying. He said, "Pity cries and then goes away, but compassion stays." And that bullet for me, I mean, staying can be geographical, but it can just be a state of mind, isn't it, of engaging. Obviously, you've given you a life and you've chosen to stay in a very literal sense. Want to come to all that, but let's go right back, because I'm guessing from your upbringing, it was unlikely that you'd end up doing what you're doing. How? Because you had a messy upbringing, didn't you?
Well, I never realised how much my, as you called it, messy upbringing would actually lead me to a place where I could actually draw upon the experiences of growing up in a lot of poverty, a lot of neglect and violence and abuse, to be able to use that in some way to help others. I never realised that it could be used that way. I grew up in the south, mainly in the southeast of England. My family travelled a lot. We basically changed house every 2 years. I was in a new school every 2 years. So it was difficult to make friends, but it was also easy, I suppose, for my mother to hide the abuse that was going on in our family, because it was never picked up on, because it was never around long enough.
Right.
And I suppose those childhood experiences really did help me many years later when I became a Christian to draw upon those experiences and help other children who are also going through some pretty tough times. So I didn't realise how extreme those tough times were until I got to Guatemala and met children who were living in the conditions that they were living.
So you already had a criminal record by the age of 13, is that right?
So yeah, I think we all. Myself and my sisters, we grew up just trying to exist. We had to sort of find our own food, basically. So we would go off stealing after school, anything we could find. Whether that was people's food out of people's gardens, anything in the collection box at churches. I mean, anything we could steal, we would steal and it was mainly just to survive. It was just to get us, keep ourselves alive. And then, that led me, to burglary, led me to, doing some things that I'm not proud of doing, but, getting being arrested and put in a situation where the judge had to I remember him having to make that decision one day as he just looked down at me and looked at my social worker and said, do I send you to a youth custody centre or do I send you to a programme your social worker's proposing, which was to send me to a farm? I quite liked the farm option because I was working part-time on a farm. And in the end, the judge decided to give me a break. And it was that break that led me down the path that eventually led me to the Lord.
All right. You talk about planning to commit suicide when you're 21, so things were pretty rough then.
I think after leaving the farm, I went to the farm because I was excluded from school at 15 and told I would never come to anything at all, so couldn't continue my education. Went to the farm, worked there for a year, then was asked to then leave this. But I mean, everywhere I went, I was just a disaster waiting to happen, really. My mother moved up to Blackpool at the time, and so I had nowhere else to go. So I made contact with her again, and she offered to give me short-term accommodation, and I stayed with her for just literally a few weeks, and then just started sleeping at friends' houses and just not having any real friendships with anybody, because I would just fall out with everybody because, I was drinking a lot. I was not a nice person. My language was pretty foul. I was stealing, still doing all that sort of stuff. And I remember finding a little bedsit, and I'm 21 at the time, and I'm in this tiny little bedsit. And I just got home from work and I just lay back on the bedsit. And everything about my life was about on the day-to-day. So I'd earn a bit of money, then spend it, earn it and spend it. And I just lay back on the bed and I'm looking around at what I've got. And, a couple of changes of clothes, a little radio, and nothing else in the way of possessions. Family didn't want me, no friends, no stable job, police always knocking on my door. And I just thought, this is not life. Life for me was rubbish.
Yeah.
And so the only way I thought I could cope with was doing what my sister did, was to try to commit suicide. And so I'm lying on the bed and it's darkish outside, but the street lights, you could still see inside the room. And I'm just lying there almost in darkness, looking up at the ceiling, thinking, okay, so is it going to be this way? Am I going to do it with pills? Am I going to do it with this? And thinking, when I die tonight, because I knew I was going to die tonight, when I die tonight, this thought came into my head, where do I go? What happens when you die? Because when you die, that's forever and ever and ever and ever. And that's what was going around in my head. And I don't know why this other thought popped into my head, because I'd never thought about this at all in my life. What if there is a God? Like, where do you go when you die?
Mm-hmm.
And it was that thought that, as I thought about that, just lying on the bed, even must have been about half an hour, just these thoughts going around in my head, I just cried out in a prayer that it wasn't really a prayer because I didn't know how to pray, but I just cried and says, God, if you're there, help me. That's all I could shout.
Mm-hmm.
And I know I was on the second floor of this building, this house in Blackpool, in this tiny little bed set. And I'm the only one in the house, but I'm the only one, obviously, in my room. And as I cried out, I heard an audible voice in the room speak to me. And this voice said, go to Tunbridge Wells and seek me there.
Wow.
Now, I remember when growing up in Kent, not that I ever lived in Tunbridge Wells, but I vaguely knew where Tunbridge Wells was. And I knew it was in the south of England. And so the next morning when I woke up, I'm like, I've got to go to Tunbridge Wells. And so I went in, I said to my boss, I'm not working anymore. I'm going to Tunbridge Wells today. And he went, you've got to give a month's notice on where I'm going because God's told me I've got to go. And he went, what? So I got on a train. I had a tiny little suitcase. I mean, it was just pathetic. This little bag I had with all my possessions in, and headed to Tunbridge Wells. I had no family there. I had no contacts there, no job. I had nowhere to live. And I've got about, I don't know, £15 or something in cash. I don't know what it was, but it was enough to get me to Tunbridge Wells. And I must have had at least £1 or something when I got to Tunbridge Wells. So it was burning my bridges. I had nothing.
Yeah.
And turned up in Tunbridge Wells. And that's where it all started happening.
Man, sounds amazing. I mean, when I arrived in Burundi, I'd had most of my money stolen, and I was down to, wasn't £1 or 15 quid. I was down to 200 quid left in the world, and I was like, God, bring it on. If you're faithful, it's going to be okay. And I believe you are faithful. But you weren't yet at that stage, were you? I mean, you didn't really understand. You'd heard this audible voice, but would you say you'd given your life to Jesus by that stage?
I had no idea what was happening. All I knew was that it was just so literal for me. I prayed, or thought, I didn't know it was a prayer. I just cried out to God, but I heard this voice in this room speak to me. It wasn't in my head. It was an audible voice that I heard. And so I turned up in Tunbridge Wells and came out of the train station, and literally across the road, Grove Hill Road it's called, there's a little newsagent, and I went in there and bought a bag of crisps because I was really hungry, because I hadn't eaten anything since the day before. And I noticed there was a sign in the window of this newsagent that was advertising a bedsit. And I asked the man if there's any chance that he could phone the number, because mobiles in those days. And he phoned the number, and this lady asked me where I was, and and the man said he's outside my shop. So she turned up, and the bedsit was literally across the road. It was 28 Grove Hill Road. Mm-hmm. And she said, you need this amount for the deposit and you need this amount for the monthly rent. And I said, well, I've got, and I showed her all the money I had in my pocket. And she said, you are joking, aren't you? And I went, no. And she said, have you even got a job? And I went, no. And she said, well, look, this is like almost 3 in the afternoon at this point. She said, well, if you think you can find a job today, get the guy to call me back. So I walked up to the job centre in town, asked where the job centre was, went into the job centre. Obviously, they were not offering me a job when the guy found out I had no qualifications. I'd been, thrown out of school, and I'd come from Blackpool, so I was from the north, so I wasn't welcome in Tunbridge Wells. And I thought, okay, I'm not going to have a job. But I walked in, as I walked further into town, I saw this It was like an Army and Navy stores in Tunbridge Wells, a department store. And I walked in, and as I walked in and I looked around, this man, it looked like he was a security guard, but he wasn't. He walked up towards me, stood in front of me, and he said, "Hello, can I help you?" And I went, "No, I'm just looking." And he said, "But by any chance, you're not looking for a job, are you?"
Wow.
And I went, "Yes, I am." And he said, "That is absolutely incredible." And he sort of swished his hand to one side as he looked at all these products. And he said, "Do you think you could sell this stuff?" And I went, "Listen, mate, I think I can sell anything for the stuff that I've been nicking," but I never told him that. So he said to me, "Okay, well, could you start tomorrow?" And I said, "I could start. You tell me the time and I'll be here." And he said, "Well, you have to wear a suit." And I said, "I don't have a suit." And he went, "You are joking." I went, "No." He said, "Come up to the men's department." So he took me up to the men's department, found a suit that fitted. So it's nearly 5 o'clock at this point.
Yeah.
So he gives me a suit, actually gives me a suit, gives me a shirt, gives me a tie, and says, "I will see you here tomorrow." Obviously, it got a little bit more difficult the next day because I only had trainers. So I walked back, this guy phoned the lady. The lady then said, "Okay, I'll let you have this place, but you can pay me back," which was really unusual. People don't do that. Turned out that she was a Christian from a local church. And that's, my life was starting changing around that. It was like midweek, and it got to Sunday, and obviously we were not working on a Sunday. And I remember waking up on a Sunday morning, hearing these church bells going and thinking, this is interesting because it's a church. That must be where God lives, was what went into my head. And so I thought, I'm going to go down to this church. I've never been in a church before, but I walked into this church, Christ Church in the High Street. And it was the weirdest experience of my life because I was given these books that I never read a book in my life, but I was given these books. And then, what are these books for? You know, song books and a Bible and all this sort of thing. Anyway, so I sit down at the front, service starts, everyone's sitting in the last 3 rows at the back. I've no idea when to stand up, when to sit down, what to do. But the fact is that even though I had no idea what they were singing about or talking about, none of it made any sense. This lady came up to me after the service and started talking. She said, "Would you like to come to lunch?" So I just said yes. And it turned out that she was the vicar's wife. And then after lunch, she then said, "We'll go for a walk." We did the walk as I went with their family. And then she said, "Oh, would you like to stay for tea?" Because I had no food in my bed set. I said yes. And then she said, "Oh, we're going to church." And I go, "What, again?" And she said, "Yes." So we did the church thing, and then I walked home. And then as I was walking home, she said, "Would you like to come to a Bible study on Wednesday?" And I'm like, "A Bible study? What's that?" And she said, "Well, we start with a meal." And she said, I'll come. There's food. So I was just going along, and none of it made any sense. And I was going to go along for literally just a few weeks to this church, Christ Church. And these people were, they said they were quite scared of me. They thought I was going to steal things from them. They remember telling me. But I was just going every week, and they were feeding me. More and more people were feeding me and taking me in and, you know, encouraging me. And I was reading all these things in the Bible, but none of it absolutely made any sense to me at all until one day. And the day came when just a few weeks later, I managed to get hold of this tiny little 6-inch black and white TV for money that I was paying someone at work, you know, a certain amount of money for this thing that he was selling. I said, "I'll pay you per month or something." And I remember trying to tune it in one Sunday afternoon, thinking, "Oh, this would be quite cool to watch something on a 6-inch screen." And the only signal I could get was the beginning of a film that I'd never heard of before called Ben-Hur.
Right.
And I started watching this film. I thought, well, this is quite good. This is like a bit of violence, bit of this, bit of that. And then this guy called Jesus pops up. And I think, "Oh, I've heard of Jesus. That's the guy we talk about in church." and then he's doing some great things. He's been nice to people and all this sort of thing. And then the next thing I remember seeing was this guy, Jesus, actually being nailed onto a cross. And then that's where my life changed, because I've realised that he did that for me. the only thing I could do was I just burst into tears and I just cried. And I remember just crying and crying and crying and crying. And I fell asleep. I woke up the next morning. I'm lying on the bed, still dressed, and I've been sobbing all night. And just, I didn't know, as I was saying, I'm so sorry, God, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry, that was the night that I gave my life to Christ.
Wow. I love it. God's sovereign work. And I love it also that how obviously you were just loved really well into the kingdom, weren't you?
Oh, it's amazing. It was just the most amazing feeling. And when I woke up the next morning, this was for me, it was weird because I remember opening the curtain and there's only one curtain. I opened the curtain and everything seemed brighter. Everything was like all these colours and it felt like somebody had cleaned me inside.
Yeah.
And I had no desire. I remember going to work and I'd stopped swearing. And I remember that there's all these things about me. I thought something is different. And when I went to this Bible study on the Wednesday, I told people and they went, "You've become a Christian." And they were so excited. I went, "Have I? Oh, what's that?" And and then literally soon after that, I saw these young people out on the streets in the high street one evening. And I said to them, "What are you doing, guys?" And they were like outside our church. And well, we got nowhere to go. So I said, "I'm going to get the keys from the vicar and invite you in." And I took them into church and started doing youth work. And it all started from there, really, this desire to work with young people.
Hey folks, I hope you're enjoying the podcast. I'm loving the response we're getting from across the world. It's just wonderful to see how encouraging and inspiring it is being and hitting the spot. Listen, if you are being blessed by it, I'd love it. Basically, this happens under the auspices of our ministry, Great Lakes Outreach, which works in the poorest and the hungriest country in the world, which is Burundi. We're having an incredible impact in the toughest of circumstances. We want to carry on supporting those local folks doing a great job. So if you wanted to, greatlakesoutreach.org/inspired. You could make a donation there. I'd so appreciate it. Also, it's word of mouth, isn't it? So gossip these podcasts to other people, get them to subscribe, give us a great review. Absolutely wonderful. So grateful to you. So that's greatlakesoutreach.org/inspired. If you want to do a couple of quid a month or a one-off donation, we'd be incredibly grateful. All right, now let's get back to the podcast. So you, I don't want to blast ahead, but you went to Bible college, you became a youth worker. Key stories from those times?
Yeah, it was incredible how God spoke into my heart. And literally, I was hearing all sorts of amazing things from God. And God was speaking to me through the word. And God was speaking to me in all sorts of ways. And eventually felt, I've got to go to this Bible college. And I had no money to go to Bible college. And I suppose one of the key things I remember when I went for the interview at Moorlands Bible College, the lecturer who was interviewing me with others in the same room, he said, "So tell me about the latest book you're reading." And I said, "Well, I've never read a book." He said, "No, and he said, "Well, no, the latest book." And I said, "Well, I've never read a book." He said, "So you've never read a book in your whole life?" And I went, "No." And he said, "And you want to come to a Bible college?" He said, "How do you think you'll get on in Bible college?" And I went, "I don't know, but God's called me to come here." He said, "How are you going to fund it?" And I went, "I've no idea, but if God's called me, he'll provide, won't he?" And he went, "Well, I suppose he will." And he absolutely did. Every single term, it was miraculous how money appeared, turned up, sent in the post to get me through 3 years of Bible college and then get my first job as a youth worker in Cheshire Boys in Buckinghamshire, and where I'm sitting now. And it was just incredible how God used me in those early years of youth work, but gave me a real heart and a passion for young people who didn't fit in, because they're the ones I love the most.
So it was as a youth worker that you watched that Sunday night program that changed.
Correct.
Yeah, right. So what were the next steps to getting out there?
So then it was literally just taking this big step of faith and moving out to Guatemala. But I had to raise some money for the charity that I'd contacted that appeared on the television program. and asked me to raise money for the running of a children's home, because that's the work I thought I was going to end up doing. But actually, when I moved out to Guatemala, I ended up working as a street worker.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember the first day in Guatemala City, even though I was still learning Spanish, just very basics of Spanish, it was easy to understand the headline of the newspaper, the main newspaper of the day. And it just had these 3 words: police rob bank. And I thought, this is different. And I remember starting my first day of work as a street worker, turning up at this organisation that doesn't now exist in Guatemala, but this organisation that appeared on the TV, and thinking, this is going to be amazing. I'm going to work with children on the streets. How cute is that going to be? How amazing is that going to be? You know, God's used me in youth work. I'm going to got some great ideas on what I can do. And I had all these, real expectation. Little did I know that it would be the most horrendous of experiences ever.
Go on, tell us more.
Well, I turned up at this organisation, and the people that were supposed to welcome me made it very clear that I was not welcome at all. They swore at me. They said they didn't want any foreigners working there. I was not the only new foreign volunteer that turned up that day. It was a guy who was in his mid-30s who was from Holland that had turned up that day. But eventually they took me out on the streets, and the guy that turned up at the same time as me, just before 8 o'clock, from Holland, he was going to stay at the refuge that morning. And I was taken to the streets, and I was taken by this man who really didn't like the idea of working with me, but he took me to this place. It was like basically a brothel for children. And it took me to this place, and I was just horrified at all the stuff my eyes were looking at. And I remember kneeling down, talking to these children that were all in bed together. And this guy came and put this machete, came up from behind and put this machete to my throat. And in no uncertain terms, and said with many expletives, "If you come back here tomorrow, I'm going to kill you." Little did I know that it was actually the charity worker himself that put this guy up to doing this, because he didn't want me working with him. And so I'd asked this guy to do this. That we went from there to visit another group of kids on the streets. There'd been a murder of a street child that night, and they were all talking about that. And then we went to visit another group of kids who then decided in the middle of a football game, who were very high on glue at the time, just to start fighting themselves and then throwing rocks at us and fighting us. So by the time we got back to the refuge at lunchtime, it was quite a traumatic morning.
Yeah.
And I remember sitting in the entrance area of the refuge, sitting down on a little chair, and the volunteer that had come over from Holland to work there came and sat next to me, and he said, "Oh, so how's your morning been?" I said, "It's been horrendous." He said, "I've had a lot of fun here." And as he was talking, this boy is about 8 years of age, comes running out, and all he was wearing literally was a pair of shorts. He had no shirt on, he had no short, he had no trousers, he had no shoes, just a short pair of shorts. And I remember he come running into the entrance area, and he came up to this guy, and the guy picked him up and put him on his knee. And as he looked at me and was talking to me, he put his hand down the front of this boy's shorts. No. And I'm looking, and I know what I would do now, but at that moment I was absolutely frozen. I just didn't know what to do. And I couldn't even talk. And eventually this guy just put the kid down and walked off. And I just sat there for I don't know how long in absolute shock. And then eventually went and said to the team that this guy I'd been working with, "This is what I saw." And then they asked him to leave, but didn't do anything about it. But I remember going home that night and thinking, this is just day one, how am I going to cope? And it just got worse and worse and worse. And it was really, really tough. I suppose the hardest thing was meeting children, and like this boy Ruben, I met this boy. He was a lovely boy that would just sit and look into your eyes and just be fascinated by stories of what life was like in England, and tell me this and tell me about that. And he was a very small 13-year-old boy. And I said to him, so why are you here on the streets? He said, oh, my dad did this. And then I ran away from home. And I said, do you think I could help get you back to your family one day? And he said to me, look, Duncan, he said, there's no point, because all kids die on the street. And I said, but it doesn't have to be that way for you. And he just laughed, and he put his hand on my arm, and he said, but thanks for coming to visit anyway. And about 3 hours later, he was shot dead.
Oh dear.
He and another boy, Daniel, who was just 10, was sleeping in a doorway, shot dead at point blank range by 2 police officers. And the next day, we had to go and pick up their bodies and put them in coffins and bury them. And what was odd was I was the person carrying his coffin alone. It was just me. That some family had been contacted to bury Daniel, but no one there was Reuben. And I carried him and pushed him into the grave, in this little coffin into the grave. And I just thought to myself, I'm absolutely distraught with everything that's happened. But also, here's a kid I'd started getting to know and thought I could make a difference in his life. And now I was burying him. And it was something that changed my commitment and saying, it's the compassion thing,
Yeah.
It's not pity. I've now got to give the rest of my life to doing this.
Yeah.
And when I went out there, the BBC Everyman programme, I remember the script of the narrator when he says there were 5,000 street children in Guatemala City. Each day they literally set out to live or die on the streets. And the number 5,000 stuck with me. And every year we carried on doing surveys of the number of children that were living on the streets and rescuing more children and helping more children. And we got to the point 25 years later, 5 years ago, where we rescued our last child off the streets of Guatemala. So much so that it was one of the first countries in Latin America where there were now no more children living on the streets of Guatemala.
Amazing. 25 years. Wow. And that's genuine. There's not a single street child in Guatemala.
No, that is genuine, and it hasn't been for 5 years.
Incredible. Wow. And presumably it's been quite dangerous work taking on entrenched systems of injustice like that.
I think the early days were the worst, when you literally had to stand between a policeman and his gun and a street child. Or people that would come up and, put a gun to your head or put a gun to your stomach, more to stomachs for me, maybe because of the height thing, I don't know. And coping with that. But I think one of the most interesting, strangest and scariest for me at the time experiences was a few years ago when I was working with a group of kids in a place called The Terminal in Guatemala City. It's a pretty rough area, Guatemala City. And it's policed by these contract killers. They're called the Angels. And usually the Angels, most of them know me. They know me well. And they're there to protect me, not to assassinate me. But they are there to kill people who steal. And I was working with a group of kids one day, and this guy just was staring at me the whole time I was working with them. And then he beckoned me over when we finished, and he said, "Come over here, gringo." And I went over, and I thought I won't, rise to the gringo bit, but I'm an Englishman, And he said to me, "I'm going to effing kill you now." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "I know what you do. I've been watching you for a long time." He said, You're working with these children, but you take them to your country, don't you? And what do you do there? Do you remove their organs? And I'm like, where do you get that idea from? And he said, "I know that's what you do, and we don't want your type here in the terminal, so I'm going to kill you." And he has his revolver tucked down his trousers, and he's got a hand on his revolver. And so he looks at me, and I said to him, "So if you're going to kill me, could you at least give me 1 minute of your time?" And without waiting for an answer, in 1 minute, well, it actually 1 minute went to 3. I just talked and talked and talked and just gave him my testimony. And I thought, well, if he's going to kill me, at least the last thing I want to be known for is that I'm going to be declaring the praises of Jesus and what he's done in my life. And so I gave him my testimony. And then he said to me, and this was the most scary bit. And then he said to me, so now I understand why. And I went, what? And he said, well, I had this question in my mind that I didn't want to ask you. He said, but now I understand why. And I went, what? Why? And then as soon as he starts talking, all the hairs on the back of my head went up. And he said to me, you were here on Thursday night, a few nights ago. And he said, when you left this building, you walked down out of the alleyway, you walked down the alleyway, then you turned left. And I thought, oh my goodness, that's exactly what I did. And he walked along there and he said, you know what? He said, I was going to kill you then. I got out my gun. I tried to shoot you in the head twice. I tried to shoot you in the chest. He said, and this gun, and he slaps this gun. He's got the gun in his hand. He said, this gun has never failed me. He said, it wouldn't work. And I tried it 3 times to shoot you, to kill you, and it wouldn't work.
Wow.
And he said, and now I know why. He said, because God is with you. And he said, not only is God with you, and he puts his hand into the small of my back, and he said, my friend, he said, now I'm with you.
Wow. Amen. Oh, love those stories. Oh, so, well, glad you're still with us. I think probably a lot of people are. So go on. We love these stories. What are the most amazing things you've seen God do? I mean, that's already one, but keep telling us these stories in Guatemala.
I think the way that God starts changing the lives of young people, children. I mean, just 2 days ago, I got a photograph of a girl who's in Copenhagen at a conference. She's speaking there at a women's conference. 3 years ago, she was invited to speak at a conference in India to talk about women's rights. And it was amazing seeing this photograph of Rita, who was born in Honduras. First time I met her, she was 5 years of age. She was living on the streets of Tegucigalpa, the capital. And I was working in both Guatemala and Honduras at this point. And I remember her coming off the streets, her hair all matted, eating like an animal, cowering under a table. And now she's this beautiful woman who God has transformed her life. She's so in love with the Lord, who's given her this crazy and amazing opportunity of traveling the world, talking about her experiences, what God has done in changing her life. And not just that, so many of the young people. Yesterday, I was sent a video, a very short video of one of my boys that I mentor. He's 16. He's called Kennedy. He likes rapping. And he was out evangelizing in one of the slum areas with one of our workers. And the way he was doing it is by rap. And so the short video that he sent me, our team showed me this boy, Kennedy, rapping. And it's the biggest miracles for me are the changes, the lives of children that God has changed. They're transformed their lives. And I suppose one of the biggest ones I want to tell you about is this boy that's hopefully coming over to the UK soon, because he's been offered an opportunity to be a trainee youth worker at Carity Wood in Kent. And he is 18. He's just getting his passport next week in Guatemala, and he's very excited. I remember when I first met him, he was 10, and he was living on the rubbish dump. And I went to work with his brother, who was 11, and the mum said to me, why do you want to help him? And I said, well, these are the types of kids. And I was explaining, without getting her offended. And she said, oh, it's not him you want to work with David. It's Danilo. Danilo is 10. He's a drug dealer. He's addicted to drugs. He's addicted to cocaine. At the age of 10, he's a tiny 10-year-old boy. And so I started working with him, and his language is foul. His behavior is awful. We get him into the mentoring program. We eventually he starts growing up, and he's 13, and he comes to the youth group. And I remember I'm watching him at one of the youth groups. One of the young people had their hands in the air we were having some worship, and he had his eyes closed. And this boy, Danilo, was poking him in the eyes. And he was like, you don't believe in that rubbish, do you? And all this sort of stuff. And he just, it was a real pain to have. But one evening he came, and he was really quite quiet, and he sat opposite me. And one of the team said, anyone want anything for prayer? And he put his hand up, and all the young people groaned because they think Danilo's going to say something completely stupid.
Mm-hmm.
And he said in a really funny way, he said, please, can you pray for my mouth? And he was trying to say, please, can you pray for my mouth? But he said it in a funny way that everyone was laughing. And he pushed his tongue out. And as he pushed his tongue out, there was this horrible silence. And I leaned forward and looked at his mouth, and it was completely covered in blisters. Apparently, he picked up this can of Coke on the rubbish dump, thinking there was still Coke in it, took a swig of it, and it was acid.
Oh, dear.
And as the day had gone by, the acid had slowly, more and more, burnt his mouth, the whole inside of his mouth. And he said, I can't feel my tongue, I can't feel. And he had these blisters on the inside of his mouth and on his tongue. And he looked in a lot of pain. He was in a lot of pain. And he said, please, will you pray for me? And so the boy next to him put his hands on him, prayed for him. We prayed for him. And we said, amen. And he opened his mouth and he went, I am healed.
Wow.
It was just incredible. There, visibly in front of us, his mouth was completely healed. And he gave his life to the Lord. And since then has committed his life since the age of 13 to being a youth worker with us as part of our team, and is now 18. And, his life is, well, he's got a YouTube video of his testimony, just incredible. I'm sorry, I keep crying all the time, but
I love it.
God is changing people's lives and continuing to change lives and doing amazing things. If I had another hour, I'd tell you so many more stories, but it's amazing. Really is, Simon.
Yeah, I'm annoyed because time is running out, and I know there are so many more stories. Listen, I just want to understand, because you started Toy Box, you've also started Streetkids Direct. So talk briefly about those two. Okay,
well, with the first charity I set up, Toy Box Charity, and that was the charity that helped funded the work that I started doing in Guatemala. Then many years ago, 2000, Toy Box, I wanted to carry on working in Guatemala. Obviously, Toy Box has moved on and started working in other countries. So we went our separate ways. I set up a very different type of charity, Streetkids Direct, which is an internet-based only charity. So it's no offices, no UK cost whatsoever. And it's really just focused my work mainly on Guatemala, although we have started having an influence in Honduras and Mexico and Venezuela now. But mainly that's where I now focus my work. And continue to live full-time in Guatemala and work still on the streets.
And recognised by the authorities as you got this end, you got an MBE in 2017. Was that more for the Toy Box, or was that more for the Streetkids Direct?
It was mainly because of these crazy walks I was doing. That the British ambassadors in Guatemala, the British ambassador and his wife, decided that they wanted to recognise this walk that I did. I walked from Costa Rica to Guatemala to raise money for the work, and they joined me, and as I walked into Guatemala City, flanked by all these police officers from the municipal police. And as a result of that, they spoke to the then Foreign Secretary, which was Boris Johnson, who then recommended me for an MBE, and I got the MBE. But mainly it was because that year was the 25th year, and the walk, and no more children living on the streets. And that's what it was celebrating.
No more children living on the streets. That's mind-blowing. I mean, we've got a Street Kids project in Burundi called New Generation. They're doing great work, and they're all those kids are tomorrow's rapists and murderers and rebels, often recruited for the rebellion. And yet we can see 20 years on, 23 years on, we can see, they're NGO workers, they're in healthy families, businessmen. I mean, it's beautiful, but we still have, in the thousands of street kids. So it can be done. That stirs faith in me. Listen, you're clearly a dream and a visionary. What are your dreams and visions for the way ahead?
I think what we're keen to do is to continue to prevent more children now taking to the streets. We've got this really innovative program, a mentoring program that took me 3 years to design, that really targets the most vulnerable children of becoming street children and working with them. So that's really what our focus is. And also then coming alongside those like Rita, like Danilo, like others that have been rescued off the streets, and helping support their ministries. and coming alongside them. And they want to go to places where there are children still living on the streets. So we are looking for new opportunities of new countries where there are children still living on the streets, and being able to go there and offer the resources, offer the programs that we've developed, the training materials, and offer volunteers and missionaries from our young people themselves, and see if we can come to a point where there are no more children living on the streets in the world.
Wow. Small dream there. Okay, listen, give me one more juicy story and then we'll have to call it a day.
Juicy story. Okay, well, one of our new volunteers, a guy called Luis. Luis, when I went to see him last year, he was working in a sort of Airbnb place. I'd taken a group of boys down to this Airbnb place as the end of year celebration of all that they've done. And the guy who welcomed us was this guy called Luis, Guatemalan. Said hi. Said I'm the manager, but sort of does all the the sort of maintenance for the place as well. Nice guy. But it was quite a stockily guy. And the people that were running it were Americans. And they said, they kept saying to Luis, why don't you tell the boys your story? Why don't you tell the boys your story? So eventually, and under much duress, he sat down on our last day, an hour before we left. And he said, okay, well, I've been asked to tell you my story. So he said, I've just heard my son has overdosed in prison. And he said, actually, let me tell you the story another way. He said, the prison where my son has just died, he said, I spent 14 years of my life there in LA. He said, I was one of the two main leaders of the 18th Street gang in Los Angeles. And then as part of his role as a gang leader of the 18th, very violent gang, he's involved in assassinations, kidnappings, bank robberies, drug dealing, you name it, arms trading. He's done everything. And eventually when the authorities collect him and put him in prison, they are so happy that this guy is put in prison. The minute he gets into prison, covered in tattoos, big guy, he becomes the leader of the prison because he's the head of the 18th Street gang. And he said, I'm running the prison, so if I want someone killed, I just click my fingers, they're killed. If I want this, if I want a gun brought to me, if I want drugs, everything happens. He said, I knew at one point that somebody would try to take my job and kill me. And he said, this particular night, this is when it happened. He said, I'm in my cell, and at the end of the cell, you've got a guard that sits behind bulletproof glass, and he has to press a buzzer to open a gate. There are 4 gates between the guard and my cell, and my cell is just a cell door of bars, so you can look through it. And he said, I hear late at night the buzzer go and the gate open. I'm thinking, that's not normal. And I put my hand out, and in my hand there's a little mirror. And I look up and I could see that this massive guy is coming down through the gate. And as the gate closes, the buzzer goes and another gate opens. And he said, you need the guard to do that. But he said, I look up at the guard through my mirror, and the guard is slumped up against the glass. So I'm thinking, he's killed the guard. There's somebody obviously in there that has access to the buttons, and eventually comes through all the gates, stands in front of me. I've wrapped sheets around my body. I've wrapped sheets around my hands. I'm ready for the fight of my life. And this guy looks at me and he says to me, God has sent me here to tell you this. And he said, what he told me, he never said what he told. He said, but what he told me made me fall down on my knees and give my life to Christ.
Wow.
And he said, and then this guy walked back through all these locked gates. And he said, and I looked again with my mirror in my hand. And he said, as soon as he walked past the guard sat up like nothing had ever happened. And he said the prison have no recollection at all that this guy had ever come through the gates. And he said, for me, that was the biggest miracle. He said, but the next day, I'm teaching about the Christian faith to everybody in prison. And almost everyone in prison becomes a Christian. And he said, I'm doing Bible studies and I'm leading all these Bible studies. And eventually the government gave me this option to be extradited to Guatemala. And but I would never be allowed back in the US. And I took that option and I wanted to serve the Lord. I had no job. I had nowhere to live when I came back to Guatemala because I hadn't been there since a child. He said, but when I got there was an American couple that had said, God has sent us here to pick you up and offer you a job. And he said, and that's where I've been for the last 3 years.
Love it. Oh, I mean, you can't even, words aren't adequate, are they, when you hear that sort of stuff? Dunc, listen,
God is good.
he is so good. How can people track with you and be involved?
If anyone's interested in knowing more, praying for us in any way, do contact us at the Street Kids website. It's easy to do. Street Kids Direct. Just do a search, Street Kids Direct. We'll come up there. And all the information about contacting is there. If you send an email, it'll come directly through to me, because there's only me that runs the whole thing. So it's a very small, friendly charity. And I'd love to hear from you.
Brilliant. Keeping organisational administrative costs to an absolute minimum. Love that as well. Listen, Dunc, it's been a real pleasure. Guys, if you've enjoyed it, I'd love you, well, straight away, there's streetkidsdirect.org.uk. We'll put that in the blurb. But please give us a great review on Spotify, iTunes. It just means the algorithms will push our content to more people, and I love it how it's impacting. We've got listeners in over 100 countries now. It's just fantastic. So you can be a part of that, helping spread the word. Give us a great review. If you want to be in touch with me, it's simongilbert.com or any of the social media platforms. I want to thank Adam Thomas Steer for the editing and Mike Sandeman for the mixing. Next week, we'll have another superb guest. And please be back with us then. Duncan, can I just say a big thank you? God bless you loads.
Thank you, sir.
Great. And everyone else, toodaloo.